My parents convinced me I was mentally disabled for 17 years. When I found out why, they tried to have me declared incompetent. The needle went into my arm wrong that morning. Mom had been giving me my weekly vitamin injection since I was 4 years old, but this time her hand shook and the metal scraped against bone. I cried out in pain, jerking my arm away instinctively, and saw something flash across her face that I'd never seen before. Fear. "Sorry, sweetheart," she said quickly, grabbing my wrist tighter than necessary. "You know how important these vitamins are for your condition. Hold still for Mommy." But as the burning liquid entered my bloodstream, I noticed something different. Usually, the injection made me drowsy and compliant within minutes, ready for my afternoon nap and evening cartoons. This time, my mind felt electric, sharp, like someone had just turned on a light in a room I'd been living in darkness for years. I was 21 years old, but according to my parents, my brain worked like a child's. Severe cognitive developmental disorder, they called it. I'd never questioned the diagnosis because why would parents lie about something so devastating? They homeschooled me with picture books, spoke to me in simple sentences, and made every decision about my life because I was supposedly too impaired to understand complex concepts. But sitting in that kitchen chair with the needle mark throbbing in my arm, I found myself really looking at my mother for the first time. Her perfectly styled hair, expensive jewelry, designer clothes. We lived in $1 million house, drove luxury cars, took elaborate vacations. For a family supposedly devoted to caring for their disabled son, we seemed remarkably wealthy. "Mom," I heard myself say, the words coming out clearer than they had in years. "Where does Dad work?" She froze with the empty syringe still in her hand. "You know Daddy works at the office, honey. Don't worry about grown-up things." But I was worrying. For the first time in my life, questions were forming in my mind faster than I could process them. Why had I never seen Dad's office? Why did we never have visitors? Why was I the only homeschooled kid I'd ever met who never went anywhere or did anything? That afternoon, while Mom was at her book club and Dad was supposedly at work, I did something I'd never done before. I explored our house. Really explored it. Beyond my bedroom and the living areas where I was allowed to spend my carefully supervised time. The first door I tried was Dad's study, a room I'd been told was off limits because it contained important papers that would confuse my simple mind. But when I turned the handle, my heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered with medical diplomas and certifications, not for psychiatry or developmental disorders like I'd expected, but for nephrology, kidney medicine. Dr. Robert Hayes, MD, nephrology specialist. My father wasn't just any doctor. He was a kidney doctor. And suddenly, fragments of overheard conversations started making terrible sense. Late-night phone calls about compatible donors and tissue matching, whispered discussions about my brother Nathan's deteriorating condition and running out of time. I opened the filing cabinet with shaking hands and found folders labeled with both our names. Nathan's contained medical records documenting progressive kidney failure, genetic test results, and treatment plans that all led to the same conclusion. He needed a transplant within 6 months or he would die. My folder was different. Instead of medical records, it contained psychological evaluations, competency assessments, and legal documents I didn't understand. But the words I could make out made my blood turn to ice. Cognitively impaired, unable to provide informed consent, guardian authorization for medical procedures. At the very bottom of the stack was a contract with something called Advanced Organ Procurement Services. The letterhead showed today's date, and the document outlined a procedure scheduled for next week. Harvesting a viable kidney from cognitively disabled donor, age 21, with parental consent as legal guardians. They weren't planning to ask me to donate a kidney to save Nathan's life. They were planning to take it from me without my knowledge or permission, using my supposed mental disability as legal justification. I staggered backward from the filing cabinet, my mind reeling with the implications. 21 years of treatment for a condition I was beginning to suspect I'd never had. 21 years of being kept isolated and dependent while they built a legal case for my incompetence. 21 years of being groomed as a spare parts donor for my younger brother. The sound of Mom's car in the driveway sent me racing back to my room, where I collapsed on my bed and tried to process what I'd discovered. But even as panic flooded through me, part of my brain was working with a clarity I'd never experienced before. The weekly injections weren't vitamins. They were some kind of medication that kept me foggy and compliant. And today's injection had been different somehow. Weaker, maybe, allowing my real intelligence to surface. At dinner that night, I watched my family with new eyes. Nathan, 18 and preparing for his senior year of high school, talked excitedly about college applications, while Mom and Dad hung on his every word. He was their golden child, brilliant and accomplished, and deserving of any sacrifice to keep him alive, including sacrificing me. "How was your day, Michael?" Dad asked, using the same patronizing tone he'd used my entire life. "Did you work on your puzzle?" I wanted to scream that I'd spent the afternoon reading his medical journals and understanding every word. Instead, I nodded and mumbled something about pretty pictures, watching his face relax with satisfaction. He liked me docile and simple. They all did, because simple meant I couldn't object to their plans. After dinner, I excused myself to use the bathroom and instead crept back to Dad's study. This time, I photographed everything with the old digital camera I'd found in Nathan's closet. The medical contracts, the psychological evaluations, the organ procurement documents. If I was going to expose their plan, I needed evidence. But as I was putting the camera back in Nathan's room, I found something that made my stomach lurch. His browser history, which he'd obviously forgotten to clear. Dozens of searches for organ transplant recovery, living donor procedures, and most chilling of all, what happens to donors after surgery. Nathan knew. My younger brother, whom I'd loved and protected my entire life, knew exactly what our parents were planning to do to me. The next morning brought another injection, but this time I was ready. When Mom turned to get the alcohol swab, I pressed a small piece of tape over the injection site on my arm. The needle slid in normally, but most of the liquid ran down my skin under my sleeve instead of into my bloodstream. Mom didn't notice the deception, and I spent the day pretending to be drowsy while actually feeling more alert than I had in years. Over the following week, I continued the charade while secretly gathering information. I listened to phone conversations through the heating vents. I read medical journals in Dad's study when the house was empty. Most importantly, I called the number on one of the organ procurement documents and pretended to be Dad's office manager, confirming details about the upcoming procedure. What I learned made me physically sick. The operation wasn't just about taking one kidney, it was about harvesting multiple organs while I was under anesthesia. Kidneys, liver tissue, bone marrow, corneas. They planned to take everything they could use and then claim I'd died during a routine medical procedure due to complications from my underlying condition. They weren't planning surgery. They were planning murder, disguised as mercy. But the most devastating discovery came when I found the insurance documents. For 17 years, my parents had been collecting disability payments for my care. Not just government benefits, but private insurance settlements from a car accident I supposedly couldn't remember due to my brain injury. The total amount stolen in my name was over $2 million. There had never been a car accident. There had never been a brain injury. I had been systematically drugged and psychologically manipulated since early childhood to create the appearance of mental disability, all so they could collect money and, eventually, harvest my organs to save their preferred child. The day before the scheduled surgery, I made the most terrifying decision of my life. I was going to run, but first, I needed to confront them with what I knew, if only to see their faces when they realized their perfect victim had discovered their perfect crime. At dinner that night, I set down my fork and looked directly at Dad. I know what you're planning to do to me tomorrow. The silence that followed was deafening. Mom's face went white, then red, then white again. Dad's jaw clenched so hard I could hear his teeth grinding. Nathan stared at his plate like it might save him from this moment. Michael, sweetie, Mom started, slipping into her syrupy voice. You're confused again. Tomorrow you're just having a little medical procedure to help you feel better. I'm not confused, I said, my voice stronger and clearer than it had ever been in their presence. I found the contracts. I know about the organ harvesting. I know about the disability fraud. I know Nathan needs a transplant, and you've been conditioning me to be his donor since I was a child. Dad's mask finally slipped completely. The loving, patient father disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. You don't understand what's at stake here, Michael. Nathan has infinite potential. He could cure diseases, change the world. Your sacrifice will save a life that matters. My life matters too, I said, surprised by my own conviction. Does it? Mom's voice was ice cold now. What have you contributed to this family? What could you possibly accomplish with your life? Nathan is brilliant, accomplished, destined for greatness. You're nothing but a burden we've carried for 21 years. At least this way, your worthless existence will finally serve a purpose. Their words hit me like physical blows, but they also clarified something important. These people had never loved me. They had raised me like livestock, keeping me healthy and compliant until it was time for slaughter. I'm leaving, I said, standing from the table. And I'm going to the police. Dad laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. With what evidence? Who's going to believe the confused ramblings of a severely mentally disabled man? We have 17 years of medical documentation proving your incompetence. We have legal guardianship. We have the authority to make medical decisions on your behalf because you're too impaired to understand them. Michael, Nathan finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I'm dying. The doctors say I have maybe 3 months left. Please don't let me die because you're having delusions. Even my brother, who I'd thought might have some natural affection for me, saw me as nothing more than spare parts to keep him alive. I walked calmly to my room, packed the few possessions that felt meaningful to me, and climbed out my bedroom window into the night. I had $347 in cash that I'd saved from birthday gifts over the years, a backpack full of evidence, and no plan beyond getting as far away from my family as possible. The bus station was a 20-minute walk through suburban streets I'd never seen after dark. I bought a ticket to the state capitol, figuring a bigger city would offer more resources and anonymity. During the 3-hour ride, I studied the documents I'd photographed, trying to understand the legal and medical complexities of what had been done to me. The medication they'd been giving me wasn't just a sedative. It was a cocktail of antipsychotic drugs and mood stabilizers designed to suppress cognitive function and create artificial symptoms of developmental disability. The psychological evaluations weren't objective assessments, but carefully orchestrated performances designed to document my supposed impairment. Every aspect of my life since early childhood had been manipulated to support their eventual claim that I was too mentally disabled to refuse organ donation. The isolation that prevented me from developing normal social skills, the infantilizing treatment that kept me dependent and compliant, the fake medical history that would justify any legal guardian making life or death decisions on my behalf. I arrived in the capital city as the sun was rising, my mind clearer than it had ever been, but my body shaking with withdrawal from the medications I'd been on my entire conscious life. The first priority was finding someone who would listen to my story and believe it despite the documentation my parents could produce about my supposed mental state. The public library opened at 9 a.m., and I spent the morning researching legal aid organizations, disability rights advocates, and medical malpractice attorneys. Most seemed focused on protecting people who were actually disabled rather than someone claiming to have been fake disabled by abusive parents. Finally, I found a listing for the State Bureau of Vulnerable Adult Protection. Their website described investigating cases of abuse, neglect, and exploitation of adults with disabilities. If anyone would understand the implications of my situation, it would be them. The social worker who took my initial call was professional but skeptical. She'd heard plenty of stories from people claiming their families were plotting against them, and most turned out to be paranoid delusions or misunderstandings. But when I started describing the medical documents and organ procurement contracts, her tone changed. "Sir, can you come to our office this afternoon? I'd like to have one of our investigative specialists speak with you in person." The bureau office was in a gray government building downtown, filled with the kind of industrial furniture and fluorescent lighting that screamed bureaucracy. The investigative specialist turned out to be a woman named Detective Sarah Morrison, who had 15 years of experience with complex abuse cases involving vulnerable adults. "Tell me everything," she said, pulling out a digital recorder. "Start from the beginning." I spent 3 hours walking her through my life story, showing her the documents I'd photographed, and explaining how I'd discovered the truth about my supposed disability. She asked pointed questions about the medications, the isolation, the financial fraud, and the planned organ harvesting. "Michael," she said when I finished, "what you're describing constitutes multiple felonies: medical abuse, fraud, conspiracy to commit assault, and potentially attempted murder. But proving it is going to be challenging because your parents have spent years building a legal case that you're not competent to make your own medical decisions." She explained that Adult Protective Services would need to conduct a thorough investigation, including independent psychological evaluations, medical examinations, and forensic accounting of the disability payments. They would also need to coordinate with law enforcement because several of the crimes crossed state lines and involved federal programs. "In the meantime," Detective Morrison continued, "I'm placing you in protective custody. Your parents have legal guardianship documents that could be used to force your return and authorize the surgery. We need to get a court order suspending their guardianship while this is investigated." The safe house was a small apartment in a nondescript building across town, staffed by social workers who specialized in helping abuse survivors. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who spoke to me like I was an intelligent adult, capable of making my own decisions. The withdrawal from 17 years of psychiatric medications was brutal. My hands shook constantly, I had vivid nightmares, and my emotions swung wildly between rage and despair. But as the drugs left my system, my cognitive abilities continued to improve. I could think clearly, retain complex information, and articulate ideas that had been trapped inside my chemically suppressed brain for decades. Dr. Jennifer Kim, the neurologist overseeing my medical evaluation, was amazed by my rapid improvement. "It's like watching someone wake up from a decades-long coma," she told Detective Morrison. "His actual intellectual capacity appears to be well above average. What his parents did to suppress it amounts to chemical torture." Meanwhile, the investigation into my family was revealing the full scope of their crimes. The organ procurement organization they'd been working with was a front for an illegal transplant network that specialized in harvesting organs from patients who couldn't provide informed consent. The FBI had been investigating them for months, and my case provided the evidence they needed to make arrests. Dr. Marcus Webb, the psychiatrist who'd been providing the cognitive suppression drugs, was found to have dozens of other patients in similar situations. Disabled adults whose families were keeping them artificially impaired to maintain control over their finances, medical decisions, or estate planning. The network of corrupt medical professionals involved in these schemes extended across multiple states. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came when investigators interviewed Nathan separately from our parents. At 18, he was old enough to understand the full implications of what they had planned, and his psychological evaluation revealed the extent of the damage their manipulation had caused. He genuinely believed his brother was severely mentally disabled and wouldn't understand what was happening, the psychologist reported. The parents convinced him that using Michael's organs was an act of mercy rather than murder. He's experiencing severe trauma now that he understands the truth. Nathan had been as much a victim of our parents' manipulation as I was, just in a different way. They'd raised him to see me as a beloved but non-functional family member whose life had less value than his own. When he'd searched for information about organ donation, he hadn't been researching murder. He'd been trying to understand a procedure he believed was medically necessary and ethically justified. The legal proceedings moved swiftly once the evidence was compiled. My parents were arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, medical fraud, child abuse, and dozens of other felonies. The organ harvesting network they'd been working with was dismantled, with arrests made in 6 states. The competency hearing to restore my legal rights was scheduled for 2 weeks later. I would need to demonstrate to a judge that I was mentally capable of making my own medical and legal decisions, despite 17 years of documentation claiming otherwise. The courtroom was packed with reporters when the hearing began. My case had attracted national attention as an example of how guardianship laws could be abused and how medical systems could fail vulnerable patients. Disability rights advocates packed the gallery, along with other families who suspected similar abuse. My parents' lawyer argued that I was having a temporary period of clarity due to medication changes, but that my underlying cognitive disabilities remained severe. He presented their 17 years of medical documentation and claimed that my newfound abilities were actually symptoms of a psychiatric breakdown. But Dr. Kim's testimony demolished their case. She presented brain scans showing normal neural activity, IQ test results in the superior range, and detailed cognitive assessments proving I had never been intellectually disabled. The medications I'd been given were powerful enough to suppress cognitive function in anyone, she explained, not just someone who was already impaired. What we're looking at, she told the judge, is not recovery from a developmental disability, but recovery from systematic medical abuse. This young man has been chemically lobotomized for most of his life. The forensic accountant's testimony was equally damning. She'd traced over $2 million in fraudulent disability payments, insurance settlements, and medical reimbursements that my parents had collected in my name. The money had funded their luxury lifestyle while I was kept in artificial poverty and dependence. But the most powerful testimony came from me. Standing before the judge, speaking clearly and articulately about my experiences, I described what it felt like to discover that your entire life had been built on lies designed to justify your eventual murder. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady despite my racing heart. I spent 21 years believing my parents loved me, but that I was too damaged to deserve a normal life. I trusted them completely when they told me I was mentally disabled, because why would parents lie about something so devastating? But they didn't just lie to me. They chemically tortured me, isolated me from anyone who might recognize my actual abilities, and built a legal framework that would allow them to harvest my organs without my consent. The judge's decision was swift and unequivocal. My parents' guardianship was permanently terminated, and I was declared legally competent to make my own medical and financial decisions. The court also ordered restitution of all fraudulently obtained funds and established a trust to help me rebuild my life. My parents were sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Dr. Webb and his associates received similar sentences for their roles in the organ trafficking network. New federal laws were passed to prevent similar abuses, including mandatory independent advocacy for anyone facing guardianship proceedings. Nathan underwent emergency dialysis while being placed on the legitimate transplant waiting list. It would be months before a compatible donor organ became available through legal channels, but he would survive. More importantly, any organ he eventually received would come from someone who had freely chosen to save his life. Rebuilding my relationship with my brother was the hardest part of recovery. He was genuinely remorseful about his role in our parents' plan, but the damage to our relationship was profound. How do you forgive someone who was willing to let you die, even if they'd been manipulated into believing it was justified? We started with supervised visits facilitated by therapists who specialized in family trauma. Nathan was dealing with his own psychological damage from years of being taught that his life was worth more than mine. The guilt and horror of discovering what our parents had planned was eating him alive. I should have questioned it, he said during one of our sessions. I should have noticed that you seemed more intelligent than they claimed. I should have wondered why you never got to make your own choices or have your own friends. But they made it seem so normal, so necessary for your protection. Forgiveness came slowly, in increments. Nathan hadn't been the architect of the abuse, just another victim caught in our parents' web of manipulation. He'd been raised from childhood to accept a twisted version of reality where my life had less value than his, where my suffering was justified by his potential. I started college at 22, majoring in psychology with a focus on abuse recovery and medical ethics. My professors were amazed by my rapid academic progress and intuitive understanding of psychological manipulation. The cognitive abilities that had been suppressed for so long flourished in an educational environment where I was finally free to think and learn. The media attention from my case led to speaking opportunities at medical conferences, law enforcement training sessions, and disability rights conventions. I became an advocate for adults trapped in abusive guardianships and helped identify dozens of similar cases across the country. But the work that felt most meaningful was volunteering with other survivors of long-term medical abuse. There were more of us than anyone wanted to admit. Adults who'd been kept artificially disabled by controlling families, patients whose conditions had been deliberately worsened to justify continued institutional care, and people whose cognitive abilities had been suppressed to prevent them from reporting abuse. Each story I heard reinforced how lucky I'd been to escape. Many victims never discovered the truth about their situations. They lived their entire lives believing they were broken, dependent, and burdensome to the families that were actually exploiting them. 5 years later, I received my master's degree in clinical psychology and began working as a consultant for adult protective services. My experiences gave me unique insights into how abusers exploit medical systems and legal frameworks to maintain control over their victims. The work is emotionally difficult, but deeply rewarding. Every case I help solve prevents another person from experiencing what I went through. Every corrupt guardian or medical professional I help expose is someone who can't victimize vulnerable adults in the future. I keep a photo on my desk from my college graduation, the first major life milestone I celebrated as my authentic self. In the picture, I'm wearing my cap and gown, holding my diploma, surrounded by professors who saw my potential instead of my supposed limitations. It reminds me that stolen years can be reclaimed and that the human spirit can survive even the most systematic attempts to destroy it. Nathan eventually received a kidney transplant from a donor whose family chose to turn their tragedy into hope for others. He recovered fully and went on to medical school, specializing in transplant ethics and patient advocacy. Our relationship healed over time, built on honest acknowledgement of what had been done to both of us. He sent me a letter on the 5th anniversary of our parents' conviction. "I can never undo my part in what almost happened to you," he wrote, "but I can spend the rest of my life making sure other families don't destroy each other the way ours did. Thank you for forgiving me when I didn't deserve it, and for showing me what real courage looks like." The final piece of justice came when I turned 26. The fraudulent disability payments and insurance settlements that had funded my parents' lifestyle for 17 years were fully recovered and placed in a restitution fund. Instead of keeping the money, I donated it to organizations that help abuse survivors and fund research into medical exploitation. Some people asked why I gave away millions of dollars that were rightfully mine. The answer was simple. That money represented 17 years of stolen life, and keeping it would have meant accepting that my suffering had monetary value. My life wasn't for sale then, and it isn't now. Today, I work as the director of a nonprofit organization that investigates suspected guardianship abuse and provides legal advocacy for vulnerable adults. We've helped free hundreds of people from exploitative family situations and expose networks of corrupt professionals who profit from keeping people artificially disabled. The cognitive abilities that were suppressed for so long have become my greatest tools in this work. I can spot the signs of medical manipulation, recognize the legal tricks abusers use to maintain control, and connect with survivors in ways that traditional advocates sometimes cannot. Every morning when I wake up in my own apartment, make my own decisions about how to spend my day, and use my mind freely without chemical suppression, I'm reminded that freedom is not something to take for granted. It's something to protect, for myself and for every other person who deserves the right to live as their authentic self. The nightmare my parents created lasted 17 years, but it's been over for 5 years now, and in those 5 years of real life, I've accomplished more than they ever believed possible. Not because I want to prove them wrong, but because living authentically is its own reward. The scar tissue from systematic abuse never fully disappears, but it can become the foundation for something stronger than what existed before.